In a forgotten 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Tucson, a quiet janitor named Rick was moments away from overhearing a conversation that would change everything. What started as another late-night cleaning shift quickly turned into chaos when the overnight manager began tearing down a dedicated employee who didn't know he was being watched. But Rick Ames wasn't just a janitor. For 20 years, he had operated as Richard Ames, CEO of a nationwide restaurant empire, responsible for building a company from $12,000 into a multi-million-dollar operation spanning 37 states. When the abusive manager, I attempted to crush the spirit of an employee speaking respectfully about leadership and values, she didn't realize she was humiliating someone in front of the very man who could end her career with a single phone call. Richard launched a revelation that unleashed consequences far beyond what anyone in that fluorescent-lit kitchen could have imagined. What began as a simple undercover inspection transformed into a complete restructuring of power, respect, and what it truly means to lead from the bottom up. After that night, the Silver Spoon Diner would never forget the name Ames. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden identity and true leadership, can you tell us where you're watching from right now? This story about respect, dignity, and finding extraordinary character in ordinary people might hit closer to home than you think. So hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will completely change how you see the world around you. Now, let me tell you exactly how a CEO disguised as a janitor discovered that the most powerful lessons in leadership come from the people you least expect. The industrial mop bucket wheels squeaked in protest against the worn linoleum as Richard Ames pushed it through the Silver Spoon Diner's dimly lit corridors. Each revolution of the rusted wheels counted another step deeper into a world he'd forgotten existed, a world of fluorescent hums, perpetual coffee stains, and the sharp tang of industrial disinfectant that seemed to cling to everything like a second skin. 3 days, 72 hours since he'd walked through these doors as Rick Ames, armed with fake references and genuine calluses he'd deliberately cultivated by spending 2 weeks doing yard work at his Scottsdale estate. The monsoon clouds gathering outside the windows matched the storm brewing in his chesty quell parts. Anticipation and dread. Richard had built his empire on the belief that he understood his workers, that the Silver Spoon Diner chain represented something more than profit, margins, and quarterly reports. But sitting in boardrooms for 20 years had a way of distancing you from reality. The numbers told one story. He'd come here to discover the truth behind them. The employee break room door stood slightly ajar, spilling harsh fluorescent light. Into the hallway, voices drifted out. Miguel's familiar laugh, warm and genuine, followed by Dana's more cautious tones. Richard had grown to recognize their voices over these strange nights of invisibility, but something about Miguel's tone tonight carried a different weight. He positioned his mop bucket near the door, close enough to hear, but far enough to maintain his cover. Through the gap, he could see Miguel leaning against the ancient microwave, still wearing his apron from the grill station. "I'm telling you, Dana," Miguel was saying, his voice carrying that thoughtful quality Richard had noticed during their brief interactions. "Whoever this Richard Ames guy is, he built something different here, something real." The words hit Richard like ice water. His hands gripped the mop handle so tightly his knuckles went white. When was the last time someone had spoken his name with anything approaching respect? When was the last time anyone had talked about him at all, rather than to him? "My cousin Maria worked for McDonald's corporate for 3 years, Miguel continued, settling into what sounded like a conversation he'd been wanting to have for a while. Said they treated people like inventory numbers, replaceable parts in a machine designed to maximize profit and minimize humanity. But look around this place." Richard pressed himself closer to the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The familiar sounds of the diner, the coffee maker gurgling, the soft rock station playing through ancient speakers, the distant hum of the walk-in cooler amplified in the sudden stillness of his attention. "This place has soul, Dana. Even the overnight shift gets real benefits. Health insurance that actually covers things, paid sick leave, holiday bonuses that aren't just gift cards to the company store." The guy could have cut every corner, maximized profits like everyone else in the industry. Instead, he kept the old values. Dana's voice carried her characteristic edge of exhaustion, the tone of someone who'd learned not to trust good things. "You're giving some rich CEO way too much credit, Miguel. They're all the same once they reach the top. Money changers. People. Maybe most of them." Miguel's voice remained steady, thoughtful. "But I've been doing research since I got hired here. Started reading about the company history during my breaks. This Richard Ames character, he opened his first diner in 1987 with $12,000 in a dream. Worked every single position: dishwasher, cook, server, manager, before he even thought about opening a second location." Richard's breath caught. Someone had actually researched his story. Someone had cared enough to look beyond the corporate profile to find the man who'd once stood exactly where Miguel was standing now. The company's nationwide now, but every location still feels local. You know why? Because somewhere in some boardroom, there's a guy who remembers what it's like to work a double shift and still worry about making rent. That doesn't happen by accident, Dana. That takes someone who hasn't forgotten where he came from, Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway like approaching thunder. Richard recognized Carla's authoritative stride long before her voice cut through the air like a rusty blade drawn across stone. "Rivera, what the hell are you doing in here?" Richard slipped quickly into the supply closet across the hall, pulling the door almost closed but leaving a crack wide enough to see through. His heart was racing not from the fear of discovery, but from the impact of Miguel's words still reverberating in his chest. Carla filled the breakroom doorway like a storm cloud, clipboard pressed against her chest like armor, her face already set in lines of irritation that seemed permanently etched there. "Your section isn't going to clean itself while you're in here philosophizing. I was just taking my break. Carla, I've got 3 minutes left. You've got however much time I say you've got, and right now, you've got 0 time for hero worship about some CEO you'll never meet, and who sure as hell doesn't care about what happens in this kitchen after midnight." Through the crack in the closet door, Richard watched Miguel's shoulders straighten slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet dignity. The young man gathered his things without argument, but there was something in his posture that spoke of strength, held in reserve rather than submission. "Save the corporate cheerleading for your own time," Carla continued, her voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who'd learned to wound before being wounded. "We've got health inspectors coming tomorrow morning, and if this place isn't spotless, it's your head on the chopping block, not mine. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. And Rivera, next time you want to waste time talking about respect and values, remember that respect is earned through work, not words. The only value that matters here is keeping this place running." As their footsteps faded down the hallway, Richard remained hidden in the darkness of the supply closet, surrounded by industrial cleaners, spare uniforms, and the overwhelming scent of bleach that couldn't quite mask the smell of his own fear. Not fear of discovery, fear of understanding. For 37 years, he'd built his empire from mahogany boardrooms and quarterly reports, measuring success in stock prices and expansion metrics. But here, crammed between bottles of disinfectant and boxes of paper towels, listening to a young man defend values he thought he'd built into his company's DNA, Richard felt more genuinely seen than he had in decades. Miguel's words echoed in the chemical-scented darkness that takes someone who hasn't forgotten where he came from. But standing there in his borrowed coveralls, Richard realized the terrifying truth he had forgotten. Somewhere between the first million and the 100th, between the corner office and the private jet, he'd lost touch with the very people he claimed to serve. The question now wasn't whether his company's values were alive among his staff. The question was whether he still embodied them himself, and whether he had the courage to find out. 3 nights earlier, the Silver Spoon Diner squatted against the Arizona desert like a beacon of stubborn hope, its neon sign flickering pink and blue against the gathering dusk. Richard Ames sat in his rented Honda Civica, far cry from his usual Tesla, watching the evening shift clock out and the night crew filter in. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, not from nerves but from the surreal nature of what he was about to do. 40-8 years old, net worth approaching 9 figures, a company spanning 37 states, and here he was about to punch a time clock for the first time in over 2 decades. The parking lot's asphalt radiated heat even as the sun disappeared behind distant mountains, and Richard could feel sweat gathering beneath the polyester uniform shirt he'd purchased from an industrial supply store in Phoenix. The name tag read Rick Adams, close enough to his real name to respond naturally, different enough to maintain his cover. The back entrance led directly into a cramped employee break room that smelled of cigarettes, microwaved food, and industrial-strength coffee. A time clock from the 1990s hung on the wall like a relic, surrounded by OSHA posters and a handwritten schedule that had been changed so many times it looked like abstract art. Richard signed Rick Adams on the timesheet with a ballpoint pen that felt foreign in his hands. When was the last time he'd used anything other than his Mont Blanc fountain pen? The signature looked different, rougher, more like the handwriting of a man who worked with his hands rather than delegated to others. "You must be the new janitor." The voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Richard turned to find a woman in her mid-40s standing in the doorway, arms crossed, clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. Everything about her posture screamed middle management: the rigid spine, the skeptical eyes, the way she claimed space in the room, as if defending territory. "I'm Carla Red, overnight shift manager," she continued, her gaze sweeping over him with practiced assessment. "Let me make something crystal clear from the start. I run the tightest shift in this entire chain. No shortcuts, no excuses, no special treatment. I don't care if you're 65 or 25, if you worked at the Ritz-Carlton or Denny's. Here, you follow my rules, my timeline, my standards. Are we understood?" Richard nodded, studying her face with the same intensity she was using to study his. The lines around her eyes spoke of long nights and constant vigilance. Her voice carried the particular edge of someone who'd learned that respect had to be demanded because it wouldn't be freely given. This was a woman who'd been overlooked, undervalued, and had decided that authority was better seized than earned. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Miguel will show you the ropes." "Miguel?" Her voice carried across the small space like a military command. A lean man in his late 20s emerged from behind the grill area, wiping his hands on a clean towel. Where Carla projected authority through intimidation and rigid posture, Miguel radiated something entirely different, calm confidence that came from competence rather than position. His smile reached his eyes, and when he extended his hand, Richard felt genuine warmth in the gesture. "Miguel Rivera," he said, his handshake firm and brief. "Welcome to the Silver Spoon's finest hour." There was humor in his voice, but no kind of gentle irony that acknowledged reality without surrendering to cynicism. Dana, the waitress, looked up from her station where she was methodically rolling silverware into napkins. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with the particular tiredness that came from juggling multiple responsibilities. "Don't let 'em fool you, Rick. After midnight, we're all just survivors trying to make it to dawn." Her smile softened. Words, and Richard caught something in her expression: intelligence being deliberately downplayed, ambition being carefully managed. Another story, another person whose full potential might not be visible from a boardroom perspective. "Come on," Miguel said, leading Richard toward the supply area. "I'll show you where everything lives and how we keep this place running." As they walked through the restaurant, Richard found himself genuinely listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak, a habit he'd developed in countless executive meetings. Miguel explained the cleaning schedule with the thoroughness of someone who took pride in understanding systems, not just following them. "The dining room gets mopped every 2 hours, Miguel was saying, pointing to different sections as they moved. "But you've got to watch the grease trap area. Especially close customers don't realize how much oil gets tracked out of the kitchen in this coffee station." He gestured toward a corner setup that looked like it had survived several wars. "Somehow, people can destroy this thing in ways that defy physics. I swear, we could study it for NASA." Richard found himself laughing, genuinely laughing for the first time in months. "Seems like you know this place pretty well for someone who's not in management." Miguel shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both humility and quiet confidence. "Been here for months now. When you care about doing something right, you pay attention to details. Besides, we're all in this together, you know? Carla's got her way of doing things. But at the end of the day, we're all just trying to serve good food to people and get home safely." They reached the supply closet, and Miguel began systematically showing Richard the equipment: industrial mops, various cleaning solutions, the temperamental floor buffer that required specific handling. Everything was organized with military precision, suggesting that despite her management style, Carla did maintain operational standards. "Carla seems..." Richard paused, searching for diplomatic language. "Intense." Miguel chuckled, but there was understanding rather than mockery in his voice. "She's not bad, just protective, I think. This place means everything to her. Been here 8 years, passed over for district manager position twice from what I hear. Now she guards this shift, like it's her personal kingdom." As Miguel spoke, Richard caught something in his tone: not resentment or gossip, but genuine empathy for someone whose methods he clearly didn't approve of, but whose motivations he understood. This was emotional intelligence in action, the kind of leadership quality that couldn't be taught in business schools. "She keeps things running though," Miguel continued, handing Richard the industrial mop and bucket. "System works, even if it's not always pleasant. You'll see." Richard accepted the tools, surprised by their weight. When was the last time he'd held anything heavier than a briefcase? The mop handle was worn smooth by countless hands, and something about its familiarity triggered memories he'd thought were buried 16 years old. First job, learning that honest work had its own dignity. "Thanks for showing me around, Miguel. Most places the new guy gets thrown to the wolves." Miguel's expression grew slightly more serious. "Look, Rick, I don't know your story, and it's not my business, but we're all just trying to make it through the night, right? Might as well help each other out when we can." As Miguel headed back toward his station, Richard began his first shift in 37 years as an employee rather than an employer, each movement fitting the mop into the industrial bucket, adjusting the water temperature, finding the rhythm of cleaning carried the weight of rediscovery. From his position near the windows, he could observe the entire operation. Carla moved through her domain with military precision, checking every detail, correcting every perceived flaw with the dedication of someone who understood that perfection was the only protection against criticism. Dana served the handful of late-night customer struckers, insomniacs, workers getting off other shifts with practiced efficiency that managed to feel both professional and genuinely caring. And Miguel approached every task with quiet competence that extended beyond his official duties. Richard watched him help Dana with a difficult customer, assist Carla with inventory without being asked, and maintain quality standards, not because he was being monitored, but because excellence was simply his personal baseline. As Richard pushed his mop across floors that represented his empire's foundation, he began to understand that he'd come here to observe his company's culture. Instead, he was being forced to confront the difference between management and leadership, between authority and influence, between the view from the boardroom and the reality on the floor. The lesson was as humbling as the mop in his hands, and far more valuable than any consultant's report could ever be. The second night arrived with the weight of purpose. Richard had spent the day in his Scottsdale home, staring at quarterly reports that suddenly felt abstract, disconnected from the reality he'd witnessed 12 hours earlier. Numbers on spreadsheets couldn't capture Miguel's quiet competence, or Carla's defensive authority, or Dana's careful intelligence. They were human beings, not metrics, and he was beginning to understand how dangerously easy it was to forget that. From 30 floors up, if he wanted to truly understand the culture of his company, not the sanitized version presented in board meetings, but the actual lived experience of his employees, he needed to see how people acted when they believed no one important was watching. So he developed a strategy. Small tests, nothing malicious or unfair, just opportunities for character to reveal itself naturally. Near the end of his shift, Richard positioned himself near the front counter display of condiment bottles, sugar, packets, and promotional materials. With deliberate clumsiness, he backed his mop bucket into the display, sending packets of ketchup, mustard, and sugar cascading across the floor in a chaotic mess that looked far worse than it actually was. "Damn," he muttered, loud enough to be heard throughout the dining area. The response was immediate and telling. Carla appeared within 30 seconds, her face already cycling through expressions of irritation and assessment. She stood over the scattered packets like a general surveying battlefield damage, her clipboard clutched against her chest. "What happened here, Rick?" "Sorry, Carla. I backed into it with the bucket. Wasn't paying attention." Richard kept his voice appropriately apologetic while watching her reaction carefully. "You bet you're sorry." Her tone carried the particular sharpness of someone whose first instinct was to assign blame rather than solve problems. "And next time, maybe try watching where you're going instead of daydreaming. We don't have time for careless mistakes, especially not with inspectors coming." She surveyed the mess again, but made no move to help clean it. Instead, she continued her lecture while Richard crouched to begin gathering packets. "This is exactly the kind of thing that makes us look unprofessional. Attention to detail, that's what separates good establishments from mediocre ones." Dana glanced over from her station, where she was refilling salt shakers, offering Richard a quick look of sympathy that said everything. "Keep your head down. Don't argue, it'll blow over." Her expression also carried a wariness that suggested she'd witnessed this scene many times before, but Miguel's response was entirely different. Without being asked, without waiting for instructions, he appeared with a small dustpan and began collecting the scattered packets that had spread furthest from Richard's position. "I got the ones over here," he said quietly, his voice carrying no judgment, no impatience, just simple helpfulness. "You handle the wet mop part." "Thanks, Miguel, I appreciate it." As they worked together, Richard noticed the easy efficiency of Miguel's movements, the way he anticipated needs rather than simply following instructions. This was someone who saw problems as opportunities to contribute rather than inconveniences to avoid. Carla had already moved on to other tasks, her contribution to crisis management being criticism rather than assistance. The contrast was stark and instructive. The third night brought a different kind of test. Richard deliberately left cleaning supplies scattered in the employee break room, bottles of surface cleaner, paper towels, and spray bottles arranged to look like someone had been interrupted mid-task and left in a hurry. He wanted to see who would take responsibility for a mess that wasn't specifically their problem. The answer came during his scheduled break. Through the window that separated the break room from the dining area, he watched Dana quietly organizing the supplies without complaint or announcement. Her movements were efficient and matter-of-fact, the actions of someone who saw disorder and simply corrected it, because it needed to be done. When Carla discovered the tidy break room during her next inspection round, she didn't thank Dana or even acknowledge the improvement. She simply checked it off her mental list and moved on to the next item requiring her attention. Recognition, apparently, was not part of her management philosophy, but it was during the third night's closing routine that Richard overheard the conversation that would fundamentally change his understanding of leadership, loyalty, and the gap between intention and execution. He was mopping the hallway near the employee lockers, moving slowly to extend his proximity to an area where staff felt safe speaking freely. Miguel's voice drifted through the thin walls, initially speaking Spanish in what sounded like a phone conversation with his mother. "Sí, mami. El trabajo está bien. La gente es mostly good." Richard's Spanish was rusty but sufficient to catch the hesitation, the diplomatic choice of words that suggested complexity beneath the surface. After ending the call, Miguel continued, speaking, apparently to himself a habit Richard recognized from his own late nights and empty offices. "Sometimes the most honest thoughts were the ones we spoke when we believed we were alone. You know what's crazy about this job?" Miguel's voice carried that thoughtful quality Richard had come to associate with the young man's approach to everything. "I was reading about the guy who owns all these diners during my break. Richard Ames. Started with one place in Phoenix back in '87, and according to the company history, he worked every single position before he even thought about expansion." Richard's mop stopped moving. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to continue the rhythmic motions while straining to hear every word. Most CEOs, they forget where they came from the second they get their first taste of real money. But this guy, everything I've read suggests he built this whole company on the idea of treating workers like human beings instead of replaceable parts. Makes me wonder what he'd think if he could see how things really work down here in the trenches. Miguel paused, and Richard could hear the sound of a locker opening and closing. Would he be proud of what he built, or would he be disappointed? Like, does he know that some managers use fear instead of respect? Does he understand that the values he supposedly built into this company don't always trickle down to the people actually doing the work? The questions hung in the air like indictments, each one cutting deeper than the last. Richard realized he was holding his breath, waiting for answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. I want to believe he'd care, Miguel continued, his voice growing quieter, more personal. I want to believe that somewhere in some boardroom, there's a guy who remembers what it feels like to worry about making rent while working your ass off for someone else's dream. Because if that guy exists, if he's still in there somewhere, then maybe there's hope for places like this. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Richard quickly resumed his cleaning motions, his mind reeling from what he'd just heard. In 3 nights of careful observation, he'd learned more about authentic leadership than a decade of executive conferences had taught him. Miguel hadn't been complaining or gossiping. He'd been hoping that the man at the top of the company still embodied the values that had originally built it. The weight of that hope, and the possibility of disappointing it, settled over Richard like a lead blanket as he pushed his mop bucket toward the supply closet. Richard carried with him the understanding that his greatest test wasn't evaluating his employee's character. It was deciding whether he still possessed the courage to live up to the leader Miguel hoped he might be. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mirror the stark choice before him: remain hidden and safe in his assumptions, or step forward and face the truth about what his company had become and what he had allowed it to become. The supply closet door remained exactly as Richard had positioned it, slightly ajar, creating a sliver of visibility into the employee locker area while maintaining his concealment. He'd learned to time his presence here perfectly, arriving during the quiet moments when staff felt safe speaking their minds, when the masks of professional politeness slipped away to reveal authentic thoughts. Tonight felt different. The tension in the air was thicker, charged with the weight of 3 days' worth of observations, revelations, and growing moral complexity. Richard's hands gripped the mop handle not from nervousness now, but from anticipation. He sensed that whatever was about to happen would define not just his understanding of his company, but his understanding of himself as a leader. Miguel's voice drifted through the crack in the door, carrying that familiar thoughtful quality that had become both comforting and challenging over these transformative nights. But tonight, there was something more personal in his tone, as if he were wrestling with thoughts that had been building for weeks. I keep thinking about respect, Miguel was saying to the empty locker room, apparently working through ideas he couldn't share with colleagues still bound by workplace hierarchy. Not the kind of respect that comes from fear, where people do what you want because they're afraid of consequences. Real respect. The kind you earn by being the type of person others want to follow, not because they have to, but because they choose to. Through the narrow opening, Richard could see Miguel organizing his locker with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. Even this simple task was approached with dignity and thoroughness, as if how you did small things revealed who you were in larger matters. Take this Richard Ames guy, Miguel continued, his voice growing more animated as he warmed to his subject. I've been reading everything I can find about him and this company during my breaks. Started from nothing, $12,000, and a belief that you could run a business without sacrificing your humanity. Richard's chest tightened. The research was more thorough than he'd imagined, and somehow that made Miguel's opinions both more valuable and more terrifying. CEO of a company that spans most of the country now, probably makes more in a month than I'll see in 10 years. But from everything I can tell, he gets it. He understands that leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the person with the biggest office. It's about creating conditions where good people can do their best work. Miguel paused to close his locker, and the metallic clang echoed in the small space. I wish more managers understood that principle. Like Carla, she thinks respect comes from keeping people small, from making sure everyone knows exactly where they stand in the hierarchy. But real leaders, they make you want to be better, not because you're afraid of punishment, but because they inspire you to reach higher. Richard found himself leaning closer to the door, drawn by the sincerity and insight in Miguel's voice. This wasn't just workplace commentary, this was philosophy born from experience, wisdom earned through observation and reflection. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if Richard Ames walked through that door. Miguel's voice grew quieter, more speculative, not as some big corporate inspection, but just as a person. Would he see what I see? Would he recognize that the values he built into this company's foundation are still alive, even if they don't always flourish under certain management styles? The young man's voice carried a note of genuine hope that made Richard's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I'd want to tell him that his vision still matters to people like me, that there are employees out here who believe in doing good work, not because someone's watching, but because that's who we choose to be. That his example of starting from the ground up and remembering where you came from, that still inspires people, Rivera. Carla's voice exploded into the intimate space like a flashbang grenade, shattering the moment with its harsh authority. Are you seriously having a heart-to-heart with your locker? We've got tables to reset for the morning shift, and you're in here having therapy sessions about corporate philosophy? Richard watched Miguel's shoulders tense, but remarkably, the young man's voice remained steady, professional. Just finishing up, Carla. I'll be right out to help with setup. You'll be out when I tell you to be out, not when you finish your personal time. Carla's tone carried the particular cruelty of someone who used authority as a weapon rather than a tool. And maybe next time you want to waste company time philosophizing about CEOs and leadership theories, you can do it on your own dime, not mine. Something fundamental shifted inside Richard Ames. 3 nights of careful observation, of measured responses, of maintaining his cover while gathering intelligence, all of it crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. The man hiding in the supply closet was gone, replaced by the leader Miguel had unknowingly been hoping to meet. Richard stepped out of the supply closet, no longer concealing his presence or his purpose. The worn coveralls and industrial work boots couldn't disguise the authority that suddenly radiated from his frame, the unmistakable presence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. Actually, Carla, his voice, carried quiet power that filled the space completely. I think Miguel's insights about leadership are exactly what this company needs to hear more often. Both Miguel and Carla turned toward him, their faces cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning understanding. Carla's expression moved through irritation, uncertainty, and then something approaching panic as Richard continued speaking. With calm, measured authority, my name isn't Rick Adams, it's Richard Ames. I own this company, and for the past 3 nights, I've been working alongside you, watching how my employees treat each other when they believe no one important is listening. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of revealed truth and shifting power dynamics. Miguel's eyes widened with shock but not shame, because nothing he'd said or done required apology. Carla's face had gone pale, her clipboard trembling slightly in hands that suddenly seemed uncertain of their purpose. 8 years, Richard continued, his gaze fixed on Carla with surgical precision. 8 years you've worked for this company, managing through intimidation, treating dedicated employees like problems to be controlled rather than assets to be developed. That approach ends tonight. His voice remained calm, but carried the absolute authority of someone who'd built an empire and wasn't afraid to reshape it when necessary. You've confused authority with leadership, Carla. You've mistaken fear for respect, and most importantly, you've forgotten that the people you manage are human beings deserving of dignity, not obstacles to your personal control. Richard turned to Miguel, whose expression showed amazement but also a kind of validation, the look of someone whose faith in invisible justice had been unexpectedly confirmed. Miguel Rivera? Richard's voice warmed considerably. In 3 days you've demonstrated more authentic leadership than I've seen in some boardrooms. You help without being asked. You maintain standards because they matter, not because someone's monitoring you. You speak about respect and values like someone who actually understands what those words mean in practice. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his genuine business card, not the fake identification he'd been carrying, but the simple white card that read Richard Ames, Chief Executive Officer, Silver Spoon Restaurant Group. I'm promoting you to District Manager, effective immediately. Your first assignment will be learning the operational knowledge that Carla possesses, because despite her management approach, she understands the systems that keep this place running. Your second assignment will be teaching her what you know about treating people with the dignity they deserve. Carla found her voice, but it emerged smaller and less certain than before. You can't just come in here and I can. And I am, Richard interrupted, but his tone remained firm rather than cruel. You'll receive a generous severance package, excellent references, and the opportunity to learn a different approach to leadership if you choose to accept it. But the culture of fear and intimidation that you've created here, that ends now. He placed the business card in Miguel's stunned hands, watching as the young man stared at it as if it were a artifact from another world. Miguel, the floor taught me more about my company in 3 nights than 20 years of boardroom meetings taught me about leadership. Real leadership isn't about corner offices or reserved parking spaces. It's about what you do when you think nobody important is watching. It's about inspiring people to be their best selves, not managing them into compliance. As Richard walked toward the exit, he paused at the doorway, turning back to address both of them one final time. Oh, and Miguel, that apple pie recipe you mentioned, the one I supposedly still know by heart, I'll teach it to you personally next week. Some traditions are worth preserving, especially when they're held by people who understand their real value. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Richard Ames stepped into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind the coveralls and the charade, but carrying with him a lesson that would fundamentally reshape how he approached leadership, how he understood his responsibility to the people who made his success possible. Behind him, Miguel Rivera stood holding a business card and the keys to something far more significant than a mop closet. He held the opportunity to prove that authentic leadership could emerge at any level as long as it was built on respect, character, and the understanding that every person's contribution to the whole mattered. 3 weeks later, Miguel found a handwritten note waiting on his new desk. The floor taught me that the view from the top is only as clear as the foundation. It's built on, keep leading from where people are, not where you think they should be. Remember, respect is earned through character, not demanded through authority. The company is stronger because people like you choose to make it better every day. If this story reminded you that leadership can emerge from anywhere and that treating people with dignity creates lasting change, like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding extraordinary character in ordinary moments. The Silver Spoon Diner in Tucson still operates on the outskirts of the city, but now it's known throughout the company as the location where a CEO learned that the most important conversations happen when no one thinks the boss is listening, and where a janitor's integrity earned him the chance to reshape an entire organization's approach to leadership. See you in the next story.